Okay, so today we're going to look at Ajax, and I'm going to go through just the theory of it a little bit, just go over some slides, and then after that we'll do kind of a little demo using a couple different APIs out there that are kind of where you don't have to do any authentication. Okay, so what is Ajax? Ajax stands for Asynchronous JavaScript and XML. That's kind of what the acronym stands for, but you can think of it as a technique. It's not really like a new language. It's just a subset of JavaScript. It's like a technique in JavaScript. And the technique, it was originally used with XML, which is kind of like a language to exchange data back and forth. So a way, it looks very much like HTML, and it's a way of kind of sharing data that in a structured way. And these days, I'd say XML isn't as popular anymore. You may have heard of something called JSON, which we'll kind of see in the demo. And so typically when you hear about Ajax now, it's mostly Ajax with JSON, but the acronym, XML is still in the acronym. Doesn't mean that it can't be used, but I'd say most people just kind of found JSON a little bit more favorable than XML because we're kind of building sites and applications with lots of JavaScript. And JSON is kind of like a subset of JavaScript. Okay, so Ajax is basically a way of communicating with the server without page refreshes using just JavaScript. So really, it's just a technique in JavaScript. And if you think about kind of like when you communicate with the server, you've probably all seen contact forms, and you fill out the contact form and you press submit, and it does like a full page reload. So you're kind of making a post request. You may remember that attribute in the form tag where it was method. You say method equals post or get, and so that was your way of sending that form data to the server, and then the server can process it and then reload a new page. And so with JavaScript, or with Ajax specifically, we can do the same thing, create a form, but send that information kind of behind the scenes without that page refresh, which kind of gives a nice user experience. If anyone kind of remembers, I think MapQuest, but like every time you click on kind of a button and it reloads kind of a whole new map, it's it feels a little clunky and just maybe not as good of a user experience. So with Ajax, it kind of really revolutionized like how front ends were built and really made things kind of snappy, kind of like a mobile app that you're used to today. So you probably you see Ajax all over the place. If you're on Facebook, it's kind of really everywhere. But if these like buttons or these share buttons, they pop up modals, and this is all happening without kind of a page refresh. It's just you're talking to Facebook server. When you hit that like button, it says, okay, you like this page, and it kind of records that, but you didn't get that page refresh. Gmail is another example. So when you're kind of typing into that search bar, it filters all the results in here, and you don't actually see a page refresh either. If you kind of click on any of these tabs on the left, like drafts, categories, or chat and all that, you're talking to a server, but there is no page refresh. So it creates a really great user experience. And so this kind of allows us to create these rich internet applications. Twitter is kind of another example. You type in a tweet, pop open a modal, you hit that send button or that tweet button, it sends it to Twitter server, it writes it, and kind of appends it to the top of your wall, or kind of another example of Ajax. Yeah.
I like that Gmail example.
Yep.
You know how like more like words you type, like your filters get like your results are different. Like you know how like if you put like Ember or like EN.
Oh, and then it kind of like auto completes.
Yeah. Does it like make like get requests?
Yeah. Yeah.
Make the letter?
Yeah. Usually, usually what happens is like you type in EM or something. It'll usually do like a delay of like 300 milliseconds before sending it, because to kind of so that every letter doesn't trigger it, because usually like as you're typing, right, it's like you don't want to do it. You're typing Ember and you don't want to trigger it for M, B, E, and R. Usually it's like they have techniques which we'll get into when we actually get into Ember, but like to say, hey, cancel the previous request if you fire off a new request.
Oh.
So stuff like that. But yeah, it's essentially like slightly delayed.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think when you kind of go on Google and you just type in something and it auto-completes and you show that list of results that's relevant to what you searched in, like that's all stuff that's from the server. Yeah, you can imagine if you actually had to have a full page refresh there, then it would just be a really bad UX because it's like it just keeps reloading. So what does Ajax look like? There's actually a class inside JavaScript called XML HTTP request for doing these things. A class is also another word for a constructor function, and we're going to get more into that next week. But if you're familiar with classes, that's what it is. But the way I kind of like to introduce Ajax is just through jQuery because they have a really simple function to do it. And so this is kind of what it looks like. On the left, it's just $.ajax, and you just have to give it a little bit of information. So what's the type of request you want to make? So kind of in that form tag, you said get or post. Same thing here. There's a few other values that we can pass in, which we'll get into later. But if you're just getting information, you'll say get. If you're submitting information like a form, you would say post. And then the URL. So in this case, I want to get maybe a list of comments. And this gives us back something called a promise, which we're going to look at kind of a little bit more in the demo. But we can kind of attach a few different functions to this promise. So promise.then, and we can say, okay, if this request is successful, we can do something about it. If there's an error, we can show some kind of error notification, but this is kind of how it works. On the right-hand side, there's a few different functions built into jQuery, and so you could say $.getJSON, and that's basically the equivalent of what's on the left-hand side. So there's a few variations if you happen to kind of look around jQuery docs or on the internet. Just FYI. Okay, so Ajax is asynchronous, and so what does kind of like asynchronous mean? So if you look at this example right here, these 3 console log statements, what do you think is going to get output to the screen? Or what do you think is going to get logged to the console in that order? 1, 2, 3. Yeah, so you get 1, 2, 3. So that one's pretty straightforward. Okay, so now we have this example on the left. What do you think is going to get logged to the console? 1, 3, 2? Yeah. Okay. So it is 1, 3, 2. So we log 1, then we kind of set a timeout for 100 milliseconds. So we have to wait 100 milliseconds, and then we go to the 3, log 3, and then once that 100 milliseconds has passed, we get console log 2. And so this is basically the asynchronous nature of JavaScript, where even though the code looks from top to bottom, it looks like that's the order. It actually the set timeout is asynchronous and kind of gets put in the background until it completes, and then it happens. So here, it's 1, 3, 2. Okay, so one more, slightly different. What do you think is going to get logged to the screen or to the console here? 1, 2, 3. How many people think 1, 2, 3? Do you? Anything else? 1, 3, 2. Yeah, I guess those are kind of like the main options. So in this case, it's still 1, 3, 2. And so it's a little weird because you would think, okay, like it's not going to take any time to run the set timeout, so it's going to log console log 2. But actually, because set timeout is asynchronous, our code kind of goes top to bottom. So the way kind of the browser or the JavaScript environment runs, it's going to log 1, then it's going to fire off the set timeout and kind of register it in the background, but then it's going to keep going. And it's going to run until completion. So it's going to see that console log 3, it's going to log that out, and then there's really no code after this, so it's basically complete. And then it's going to go to whatever it was queued up in the background, and then kind of go through those. So in that case, the thing that was queued up was that function that does the console log 2. So not maybe the most obvious, but just kind of the point of all this was Ajax requests and set timeout are kind of like the main asynchronous things in JavaScript. And so they basically take time, and so they get fired off and then kind of queued up in the background, and then your script still executes, and then once it's finished, then the browser goes to what's in the queue and then kind of processes that. So there's set timeout, there's also set interval. That's also kind of another asynchronous thing. But those are kind of like the 2 main ones in the browser. Okay, so that was kind of it. I just want to go through just the theory of it, and then we'll do kind of a demo. Any questions? So all these slides are kind of, I posted the link to the course site in Slack so you guys can use this. But I'm gonna post all resources, slides, all the assignments, all that kind of stuff. So just for the new people, Blackboard's just for grades, and everything else I'm just gonna put here. Okay, so if you want to go ahead and open up Terminal, so we can open up Terminal. Let's see. So if you, oh yeah, since new people added, how many have a PC or Windows? Yes, nice. It makes it easy. All right, so if you do Command Space, you can open up Spotlight and just type in Terminal. And so you want to click on that Terminal app. All right, let me make this a little bit bigger. Okay, let's see. So I'm gonna put all my school stuff inside this sites directory. So you can kind of put it wherever you want. I'm just kind of navigating around on the terminal to find where I'm gonna put it, but I think it's gonna be inside school. Okay, so if you just want to create kind of like a folder somewhere, you can create on your desktop. I just created a folder just via the command line, but just create it wherever you want. Okay, and then okay, so I just really just created this folder. It's empty, and I'm going to open this up with my editor. So you can use whatever editor you want in this class. I happen to use Atom, so you can either kind of just drag it onto the Atom app. It's kind of one way of doing it. And then I'll create a couple files. So I'll say index.html, and I'll do main.js. Okay, so let's go ahead and just kind of put the HTML skeleton here. So I'm going to put the dot type, and then we'll kind of add in the HTML tag, and I'm just going to kind of crank through this one. So we'll say script source is main.js. Okay, so the app that we're just going to build is just going to use the GitHub API. So there's kind of very few APIs out there that don't require any authentication. I think iTunes is one, and GitHub's also another. So we can actually view this. And if you go to api.github.com/orgs, api.github.com, and this will kind of give you, well, that's the entry point to GitHub's API, and then they have a bunch of different paths off of it. And so here, I'll paste this in the Slack. And so this particular API kind of returns the information about the Ember.js organization on GitHub. So just a little bit of information like their login handle and maybe, I guess, their blog. So if you actually went to like GitHub, you could just type in Ember. It probably just, takes some of this information and shows it here. So you can kind of see some of it here. I think also I added a Chrome extension to pretty print some of this JSON. Does yours look a little bit messy? It's all black?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So install, let's see. Let me figure out which one I installed. Settings. It's extensions. Oh, JSON formatter. Okay, I think if you just Google for JSON formatter Chrome extension, and then click the first link. Yeah. So I'll paste this also in the Slack. So install it and then just reload the page, and it should pretty print. Oh, when you said all black, kind of like this? Yeah, okay. Sometimes it will be already like, formatted somewhat nicely, but sometimes it'll just be like a blob, and it's like, and you have to, it's harder to read. So this extension comes in handy. Okay, so as part of this API, we can actually go to org/ember.js/members, and this will give us a list of all the people who contribute to the Ember project. So it's kind of like an array of objects. And so this is essentially JSON. So JSON, it stands for JavaScript Object Notation. And so it's, if you look at it, it's just kind of a JavaScript data format, and that's why it works so well with JavaScript, because it is JavaScript. And that's kind of why people favor it over XML, just because if you're writing a bunch of JavaScript and you work with a format that is JavaScript, it just kind of makes things easier, as opposed to XML. Then you have to like parse things a little bit or find a library to parse, and it's a little bit more work, but it's doable. And so that's kind of why I think JSON just is favored more. But this is basically JSON, so it's not really, it's just kind of a language for exchanging data or structuring data. Okay, so the last thing that we're going to do now is, before we actually get into the code part, is install jQuery. So let's see, it's jQuery. I'll find the link and paste it. Okay, so I added a script tag for jQuery and then put the main.js right after it because we're going to have a little bit of jQuery code inside the main.js file. Okay, so if you want to just double click on that file and open it up in the browser. So you should see a blank page. Hopefully you don't see any errors in kind of the console. If you want to know how to open up the console, to right click, inspect, and then click on this console tab. And this is kind of like a nice area where we can, those console logs, we'll see that being output to this area, and it's good for just debugging. Also, another thing inside the console that I like to do just to set things up is if you click on the three dots on the right, so once you click on these three dots, there's a settings option. So click on that settings option. And this will open up just kind of a list of checkboxes of things you can configure. The one that I find really useful is this one right here on the right, where it says log XML HTTP requests. So this one kind of where my mouse is moving. Like have that checked. And basically whenever we make Ajax requests in our apps, we'll see them logged to the console. And it's just useful to know, like, is the, when we click on this button, did we actually fire off the Ajax request? We can see it. So it just helps to know if we, made the request properly. And then this also helps so we can like hop into the network panel and see if there's errors and stuff. So there's a bunch of useful debugging tips that we can kind of go through as we start adding Ajax to our apps. So, any questions? Oh, the settings. Yeah, so click on the three dots, and then click on the settings, and then check on that log XML HTTP request right here. So every time we make an Ajax request, we'll see kind of a line right here that says made this request, and it helps for debugging.
Is there any like really Chrome specific stuff that we'd be doing in this class, or can we use other browsers?
You can use other browsers, yeah. I happen to like Chrome DevTools really a lot, but you can use whatever.
Okay.
Cool. Okay, so now we can actually start writing some code. So we go over to the main.js file, and what we're going to do is make an Ajax request to this one endpoint right here. So orgs ember.js/members. So I'll just say let URL is equal to that. Also, kind of as I go along, I know like the JavaScript language has changed a lot, and so there's all this new syntax in there, and sometimes I get really familiar with it, and just because I'm kind of using kind of the latest just at work and everything. So if there's like a specific syntax that I type and you're like, I don't know what it is, just raise your hand. I'll try and make sure because I have an idea of what was taught before, but just in case, please ask. So I know like you can declare variables with var, but there's also let, and they have like minor differences, but I won't get into those now. Okay, so we have a variable for our URL. Now we can say $.ajax, kind of just like we did in the slides. And so the first, so we pass it an object in those curly braces, and we're going to say type is get. So we're going to make a get request. We could also say post, but in this case, this API responds to get because we're getting information. And then we're going to say URL is that URL variable. Okay, so that's really all there is to make the Ajax request. So let's kind of run this and see what happens. Okay, so because we checked that checkbox in the Chrome settings under here, when we did that log XML HTTP request, we see this line right here. So it says XHR. XHR stands for XML HTTP request. It's kind of like the function in the browser for making Ajax requests. But we can see that we made a request to that URL, and then this will kind of take us to the network panel, and then you can kind of look at different things here. So we can see we made this request, we got the data back, and we're just, we're not doing anything with it, but we can see that we did make a request and that it was successful. So when you click on that link inside the Chrome console, it says status 200, which means okay, means good. So anything kind of in the 200s that is good, you'll typically see 200 for successful Ajax requests. And then you can kind of view the response and some other information about it. Okay, so here, so kind of like what we had in the slides, I'm going to say let promise is equal to $.ajax. So this Ajax function, this returns something called a promise. So a promise you can think of as like this object that represents the kind of the state of this request. So this Ajax request is going to go through a few different states. It's going to be pending while it's kind of processing. And then it comes back and it's going to be either success or it's going to be error. And so this promise, we can say promise.then, and then we can pass in a couple functions. So the first function that we pass into here, this is for when it's successful. So I can do console log success. And then as the second argument to then, we'll also pass another function, and we can say console log error. Yes?
Where did you say that promise was?
So a promise is kind of like this object, and so imagine like you come to me and you say, I promise I'm going to do this week's assignment. You're not saying I'm going to do it right now, but you'll eventually get to it, right? And so you're kind of giving me this thing called a promise, which represent your intent to kind of fulfill that promise. And so that you can kind of think of it like the same in code, where it's I'm getting something back. So once I make this call, I get back this promise, but it doesn't mean that the call is done. It's going to be going through a few different states. It's going to be like right when I make it, it's in the pending state, right? Because it's still processing. And then eventually when it comes back, it's going to be in the like completed phase, which could either be complete, like successfully completed or failed completed. And so basically it's a way of saying, hey, I'm going to give you something back, this promise object, and then you can attach some functions to it, and the promise will kind of execute these functions based on whether the request fails or not, or succeeds or not, yeah. And so it's kind of weird, and basically, it is kind of a hard thing to wrap, I think, your head around. And this is probably one of the hardest parts, I think, of JavaScript, is even for me, like explaining it. But just think of it as like you get back this thing, and I can attach functions to it, and those functions will run whether the request fails or not. Yeah. Okay, so if you save it and then go back to the browser, and refresh, we're going to see success was logged to the console. So this was getting executed, and then this one did not.
I have an error.
Oh, you got an
Mine says error.
error. Okay, was the URL wrong? Like, is it exactly typed like this? Like HTTPS.
I copied and pasted it from Slack. I think it's an issue with the jQuery.
The jQuery. How many people got errors?
Well, mine's not even showing up in the console at all.
Oh, okay, that one might be easy. If you click on the three dots and you say settings, do you see that thing? Let's see where to go. Oh, here it is.
Yeah, it's checked.
It's checked.
Yeah.
Huh.
Really? It's okay.
Maybe. It's like a while.
I don't think this is it, but also maybe check the disable cache while DevTools is open.
Is that on your network? It's nothing showing up in the console. It's not throwing any errors or anything.
Hmm.
Did it push? I did save
You see
to
the
JS
blue
file,
dot.
but it didn't show up. There we go.
Save, yeah.
Appreciate you.
Anyone else have errors?
I still have mine.
Yours was, what was it?
Well, it says failed to load this file because cross-origin requests are like jQuery-3.3.1.min.js:2. Supported for protocol schemes HTTP data Chrome from extension HTTPS.
The only thing I can think that went wrong was like the URLs are not right. So here, I'll paste them again. Or let's see, did I paste it right? GitHub. That looks right. And there's no like slashes or anything in front.
No, I'm copying and pasting it directly from the Slack. At least it says error.
Okay, so I guess another, so here I'll purposely mess up my endpoint. And then if you type in error here in the function and then do console log error like this, it might be like something a little bit more descriptive. So in this case, like,
Oh yeah, it says error ready state 0, get response header F, get all response headers F, set request header F, override mine type F.
response JSON. I guess, what was the message inside response JSON? Or status text, actually.
I don't see that at all.
Do you see status text in this, like if you expand it?
Oh, it just says error.
Oh, error? Okay. I guess we might have to figure it out later.
That's fine.
Okay, so we said promise.then, we show success or error. So how do we actually get back the data from this request? So in the success function, we can just say response and just do a console log on this response. And let me fix my URL. So if you do that and then refresh, you should see kind of this array of objects logged to the console. Any questions? All good? Okay, so now if you have the data, now we can actually take this data and render it. And so we logged it to the console so we can see it looks like an array of objects. And then inside here, there's a bunch of information. I think the one I did kind of before this when I was prepping was avatar URL. So this actually shows like the individual avatar, and then we can just kind of show all the people's faces. So what we can do is just kind of go and say, I'm actually going to rename this response to members, because the thing we get back is actually a list of members. So I'm just going to call that variable members. And I'm going to say members dot for each. So this is a way of kind of looping over the list of members. Maybe in kind of like a previous class you used the for loop. The for each function is kind of a way of another way of looping, and I find it a little bit actually easier than the for loop, because the for loop you have to think about like var I, is it less than or equal to plus plus I. I mean, it's good to know, but this is just, I just want to say, hey, I want to go through all the members, and you don't have to think about I's. So what I want to do here is I'm going to say, let's kind of build up some HTML. I'm going to kind of just build up a string of images, and then we're going to kind of dump them onto the page. So I'm going to create this variable called HTML. It's just kind of a blank empty string. And I'm going to say HTML plus equal. And then we're going to kind of create an image. And so I typed in some quotes that look a little bit slanted, and I did that on purpose. So it's actually the key like right beneath the escape key. So if you, do people see that? Okay, so this is another way of defining a string in JavaScript, and it makes it really nice because we can actually have a string and then put variables in our string without having to do a bunch of like complex string concatenation without the plus or all that. So it just makes things really nice, and this is also kind of a newer JavaScript feature. So and it makes it just great for the demo. So I'm going to say image source is equal to So I'm going to say width is equal to 150. And then for the source, the way we kind of put variables into this string is we use dollar and then curly braces. So here I can say member.avatar URL. So that property kind of that we see down here in the Chrome console. Member, and then I have to add member into kind of the parameter right here. So this member, so the for each function basically kind of loops over an array, and then it will execute this function with each item in the array. So typically you kind of have that for loop, and you had to use that I variable to kind of pick out the right index from the array. In this case, it'll just kind of give us that variable for each item. And then here I can say member.avatar URL or member.event URL or member.any of these properties. So dollar, double curlies, and this allows us to inject variables into a string without having to do string concatenation. But you do have to use these like slanted quotes. Okay, so we're building up this variable called HTML, and then let's kind of let's put it onto the page. So I'm going to go back to the index page and then create a div with an ID of results, and we'll just kind of stick all the images inside this div. All right, so I can say $pound results dot HTML is HTML. So we're going to take all this HTML and put it as the inner HTML of this div with an ID of results. I'm going to get rid of the console log. We don't really need it. Yes.
So does the dollar sign and brackets allow you to pull things from? It does the same as the like document query thing.
Oh, like document query selector.
Yeah.
Oh, you're talking about this line right here?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, like right here.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you could have also said like document dot query selector pound results dot inner HTML is equal to HTML. Basically, the raw JavaScript version of that.
Okay, so the dollar sign is just a way shorter way to do that.
Yeah, that's just like the jQuery way of doing it. So either way, it's achieves the same thing, slightly a little bit longer. All right, so let's kind of refresh the page and see if this worked. And it worked, yay. So yeah, we made our first Ajax request, took the data and rendered it onto the page, and it wasn't kind of very many lines of code. It was just kind of knowing how to use that Ajax function. Any questions? Now, as a side note, I usually don't actually say like let promise equals $.ajax. I usually just kind of do $.ajax and then call then kind of directly off this. So I'll usually do something like this, or maybe space it out a little bit different. But I'm doing this on purpose just because so you know that $.ajax returns a promise. But yeah, I just want to know let you know that you can chain these things directly. You don't have to like create this variable called promise every single time. All right, so one other thing I wanted to do with this particular example was, okay, so if we go to the Chrome console and I click on this URL, and then I click on members, it'll kind of take us to this response panel, or response and preview are similar. Preview is a little bit more interactive. So if I go to preview, I can just kind of see the response. And what I want to do is take the, I think it's, let's see. Oh, I'm going to take the username, which is stored in that login property. I want to make it so that when I hover over one of these images, it's just going to show it as like a tooltip, just to show another piece of information. So if we go back to the image tag, I'm going to say title is equal to and member.login. So that login property was the one. So if you go back, login is the one that contains their username. Just showing a little bit more information. So if I go back, refresh, and if you just hover your mouse over, you can just see that small like built-in browser tooltip, the title attribute, and just kind of a nice to get their username. I'll kind of break. Actually, you also break these out onto multiple lines usually because sometimes the tags get kind of long. So I might do something like this. Okay, so this is kind of one API call. When the page loads, we just fetch the data and render it. Let's make this a little bit more interactive so that we can simulate a single page application. So kind of like what we do on Gmail, when when you click between the different like tabs and the whole, or when you switch between your inbox and the contacts. Anyone use the contacts on Gmail? And then it kind of does like I don't want to pull up my Gmail, but like it's if you go, there's like a inbox and then contacts, and then it basically swaps the entire page but without a full page refresh. So we can kind of simulate um, that experience just using Ajax with a couple buttons and a link. So I'm going to create an anchor tag here. And so this is going to say members. And I'm going to make this a dead anchor, so with a pound sign. And then I'll also give it an ID of members link. And so what I want to do is when I click on this link, we're going to then populate the results with this same Ajax request response. So I'm just going to use kind of just the jQuery, and I'm going to say, okay, let's grab that members link, and I'm going to say on click, we'll bind a click event listener to this, this anchor. And so when I click on this, I'm going to run this function. Okay, so when we say on click, this function will receive the event object, and we can say event.prevent. Well, I'll leave this out for now actually. And I'm going to copy everything that we did and just paste it inside there. So just paste that there. So now it's going to get triggered when I click that anchor. Okay, so now if I refresh and I click on members, now it kind of populates it when I click, and it kind of has that like single page app feel, kind of like Gmail. Question? No?
Do you have a dot?
Cool. Do you see errors in the console? And then the anchor tag, is there like ID members link, and then it's pound members link up here? Like nothing happens when you click it? The semicolons are usually optional, unless... No. On click. We can check it out in the lab if it's probably a small thing, usually what it is. Okay, so kind of going back to the example, if you look at my URL, So if you kind of watch it when I click on this members link, let me just zoom in a little. Well, I can't zoom in on the URL, but if I click this, you'll notice that there's a pound sign that gets appended to it, right? So it works and everything, and I've created like a dead anchor via the pound sign, but then it kind of, adds this. It's kind of, ugly. So the way we can kind of prevent that is we can say event.prevent default. And so what this is saying is prevent the default behavior of an anchor tag. So when you click on an anchor tag, it kind of uses that href and visits that, but in this case it was a pound sign, which kind of made it dead. But I'm going to say, okay, let's just prevent the default behavior of an anchor. So it'll still kind of like register this click and it'll do everything, but now it won't do this like pound sign thing. Just kind of keeps the URL nice and clean. All right, so now if I go back, click it, no pound sign, just a small thing, but. So any questions up until this point?
So for the prevent default, like a function, right?
Yeah. So it's.
What's the other uses of this?
So like the event object it just contains a bunch of information about the event. So actually we can do a console log on this. So if I do console log event and refresh, and then click this, you'll see that there's event, and it'll tell you a bunch of information like what were the coordinates of where I clicked on the screen, or key code, like if there was, I pressed like the enter key or J key or whatever, it'll tell you if you typed anything. There's just information about like what happened so that you can do things with it. Now, usually for this case, like I don't really need most of it. I just want to say, hey, prevent the default behavior of the anchor. But like sometimes with like scrolling, you can say like on scroll and then get the event and then do different things. Like scrolling is a good example, or like drag and drop, where you want to know the exact position of like where you're dropping things from a drag event. So that's kind of like what it's for. I would say the primary uses, like when I really have to dive into the event object, is like drag and drop and scroll events. Those the main ones. All right, so now I'm going to go back to the HTML page, and I'm going to add another anchor. So this will also be kind of a dead anchor, and I'm going to say ID is equal to repos link. So when I click on members, I want to show all the members for the Ember project. When I click on repos link, I want to show all the repos for the Ember project. So Ember has a bunch of different repositories or projects on GitHub. I just want to show them, and this way we can simulate like an app without any page refreshes. It's just we're clicking on links, we see content being swapped out from the middle of the screen, but there's no kind of page refresh happening. So the API call for this is, instead of /members, if you do /repos, it gives you kind of an array of repos that you can do a bunch of things with. Okay, so we can actually copy and paste the entire example that we just did, and we're just going to change a couple things to make it work for this repos link. So if you want to copy that and then paste it, and then instead of members link, we're going to change it to repos link. And then instead of /members right here, we're going to change this to /repos. And then for the HTML, I'm still going to use the slanted quotes, but we're not going to have images here. We're going to have like a little div. So we'll have a div, and then maybe inside it we'll have like an h3 containing the like the repo name. So we'll use that same dollar double curlies, and in this case, I'm going to change these variables because they're no longer members. It's going to be repos. So I changed in a couple spots. So I'm going to say repos here, repos on the for each, and then as you're looping over each one, I'm going to change it to repo. So inside the H3, if we kind of look at the response, we can see there's repo.name. So let's maybe show that. So I'll say repo.name. And then maybe underneath it, we'll also put a description inside of a paragraph tag. I'll say repo.description. So just kind of showing this name and then this description. And for an exercise, if you want, you could try like showing other pieces of information. But other than that, that should be all that we have to modify. So just kind of just changing those member references to repo. Any questions? Okay, so let's give this a try. So if I refresh, so I have these two links. Let's actually put like maybe like a bar between them so it looks separated. Okay, so if I click on click on repos, we see a bunch of repos. If I click on members, we see kind of all the members. I can go back to repos, and we're kind of simulating that like app-like experience where it's all Ajax driven, no page refreshes, and all just in pure JavaScript. Any questions? All right, so if I click on these links, so if I click on members, so click, but you can feel it's a little laggy, right? Because it takes like a few milliseconds. We can actually see how long it takes inside the network panel. So if we look at this, I think it's under, expand this. Whatever. Let's click on members, XHR. Oh, time, here it is. You can see, okay, 184 milliseconds. It's enough where if I start clicking, between the two, it does feel a tad laggy, but it's not terrible. But we can kind of improve this experience a little bit by putting like a loading indicator or a loading spinner. So we go back to our app, kind of right before we make the Ajax call. So when we click it, we can say $pound results. We're going to set the inner HTML to loading ... You could have some kind of like cool CSS spinner, but this will suffice. So I'll do that both for here. So right when I click on it, we're going to add that in. And then, so it's going to put inside that div with an ID of results, that loading text. And then when the Ajax response comes back, it's going to swap it out with kind of the HTML that we built up. So we'll go ahead and do the same thing on the other one right below it. And so now if we refresh, I click on members, you see it flash just for a quick second. But it gives a little bit better experience because then it doesn't feel so sluggish. Especially when you have like loading spinners and stuff, it kind of makes it a little bit better. Yep.
Why do you have the sign, the HTML?
Oh. Let's see. Did it add it back? Oh, really? Let's see. Members is cool. Did I not delete it? Wait, did you? I think if you delete it and then just kind of reload, then it goes away. So I don't see it coming back now. Delete the pound sign from the URL, like refresh and or just end and delete it.
Oh, okay, it works.
Yep.
So it's loading every time, right? It's
Yeah.
sending off that request. Is there a way to cache it, or is
You
that
could.
like a browser?
You could just create a variable and just store it and see like, hey, did I previously store it? If so, just pull it from there. That'd probably be a better experience, but yeah. Any questions? Okay, so the last thing I actually wanted to go over was these examples are using Ajax via jQuery. Now there's things built into the browser to do it, and one of them is this XML HTTP request. So if you kind of type it in here, it'll just give you a function, and you can kind of use this. It's a class, which we'll get into later in the class, or also called a constructor function. This was kind of like Ajax 1, and then more recently, there's been a newer function for making Ajax requests that's a little simpler, and so I kind of wanted to show that to you just because it's it's kind of easy to use, so you don't have to use jQuery if you don't want to, and you don't have to use this thing either, and it's called fetch. So fetch, it's also another function and basically allows you to make Ajax requests. So I'm going to change it just on the second example, and we'll leave the other example so that you can see both of them side by side. Okay, so the way this works, actually I'll just comment this out. And I'm going to say let promise is equal to fetch URL. So this is pretty similar. It also returns a promise, but it behaves slightly differently, where we actually have to say, I'm going to chain this, but I'm going to say .then function and when this fetch request finishes, it'll execute this function right here, the success callback, and it'll give us this thing called the response object, and there's a method on the response object called JSON, which allows us to convert it to JSON, and so we can say response.json. Now this is also asynchronous, like set timeout and XML HTTP request, this response.json thing. So this gets into a little bit more complicated uses of promises, but this right here, this returns a promise. So I can say let promise is equal to that, and then I'm going to return that promise. And so inside these then callbacks, we can actually return other promises, and a promise. So in this case, like down here, this thing won't execute until this whole thing resolves. So this kind of response.json returns a promise, and we're kind of returning it from this then call. So this return value basically becomes kind of this value here. It's kind of weird, but this is like how you do it in the browser. We go back and refresh, and I click on members, and I click on repos. We get the same behavior, and the one difference is you're going to see kind of in the console, it's going to say fetch, finish, loading. So it still kind of made the request, but it was using fetch, so it'll say fetch instead of like XHR. But I guess the main takeaway here is you can use fetch to make Ajax requests just without any jQuery. And the one caveat to this is it doesn't execute. The first function that you pass to then, when that executes, they call it resolving the promise, because like so when this executes, basically when it's successful, they say, okay, this resolved. And so when it resolves, we have this response object, and it's not like the raw response of data. It's actually like this thing that has the data kind of like wrapped inside of it, but it has to get converted to JSON. And this JSON function, it doesn't do it synchronously, it does it asynchronously. So it gives us also a promise. So we have to say, okay, let's return the promise from this first then call, and whatever that value resolves with will become the value here. So it's kind of like, yeah, if that sounded like a mouthful, it's kind of, it's really hard to explain. I'd say promises are like one of the hardest thing to teach, just because it's nothing like it.
So, like, if you put the promise.then function repo stuff in the let prompt, like that fetch kind of thing, it wouldn't work because you have to return it. Or
Say that one more time. If you
like put the like from 46 and to like 56 into after line 42.
Oh yeah, we would not be able to take this and paste it inside here because this thing is asynchronous.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's almost like behind the scenes. Because this is a promise, it'll call then on it and then wait for that to finish, and then that'll be the next chain. So actually, what I like to do, I don't know if this helps a little bit, but I will do this. I'm going to reformat this. Let's see. So we don't really need this. So I'm going to say, okay, make the fetch call. Then I'm going to take the response and then convert it to JSON. And then once it's kind of converted to JSON, then the second then call will actually have the data.
Okay.
Yeah. So this part's a little weird, but I don't know exactly why they decided to do that, but that's just how it works. So yeah, there's a few different ways of doing Ajax. You can use jQuery, you can use this fetch thing, you can use that XML HTTP request. They're all options. Or there's also other libraries out there, so you don't have to like just use jQuery. There's a handful of libraries that do Ajax. Okay, so kind of looking at this example, I click on these links. So say I click on like repos, right? So it's like I'm clicking to a new page, but then if I refresh this page, I go back to empty page, right? So it's like if you were to take this link, you clicked on repos and you want to share it with your friend and say, hey, I'm going to copy this link and share it with you. they would get a blank screen. And so that's also not a great user experience. So how can we fix that? That's when kind of actual frameworks come into play, because they'll do things like change the URL up here without a full page refresh. So kind of rewrite it, and then this way you can do things like copy that URL, give it to a friend, and still load up the same exact page that you were viewing, while still having kind of this JavaScript experience, while changing the URL without kind of a page refresh. You can do it without kind of frameworks, but it becomes a little bit more work, and so frameworks just make it a lot easier. And so Ember is actually really good at it, and so we'll kind of see that later on. But just wanted to kind of give you an idea of what a single page app kind of feels and looks like, and how you would build it, just using kind of like Ajax and just raw JavaScript. So any questions? Yes.
My fetch is going, but it's not ever putting anything into the div. So it just says loading forever.
Oh, loading. Let's see. So you have this piece, like the then and then the response JSON stuff. We can check it out in lab. We're pretty much done. Okay, so I want to go over kind of the assignment. So on the site, if you click on assignment 1, you're gonna do something kind of similar, where it's you'll use Ajax, and you're gonna use the Reddit API. Anyone use Reddit? A little bit? Okay, cool. So the API endpoint is actually this. So if you click on this, you can see what is the response for the JavaScript Reddit. You could say, I don't know if you do like cats. See all the ones for cats. You get a bunch of JSON. The response is a little bit more complicated than like the GitHub one, so slight little challenge there for you. But what you're gonna do is you're gonna have like a search form on the page. So a search box, and when you type into the search box, you're gonna make an Ajax request. You can use jQuery, you can use this fetch thing, or if you want to look up the XML HTTP request, up to you. I'd probably recommend just using the jQuery, because it's like probably the most common, most popular approach. And you'll take those results and then render out kind of the title, the score, and author of each Reddit post. And then kind of like what we did. So as I'm typing, or not, I think, let's see, what did I say? Oh yeah, okay, so you have a search form with a button. So you'll type into the text box, you'll submit the form, and then when the form is submitted, then you'll kind of fire off the call, render this data, and have a loading spinner. So you can do the loading text, or I put a link to like some of these cool CSS spinners. Makes it feel a little bit better. I think on here, if you click on like this one right here, view source, you can just copy out, like, I think you just have to put in the div and then put in this CSS, and then you can even change the colors. If your page is white, the spinner is also white. Just kind of be aware of that. So it might not, it looks like it won't show up. So just kind of change the colors here to something else, and you have a nice cool spinner. And then to submit it, create a repo on GitHub called that, and then just kind of push the files up, and then send an email to me and Finn just with the GitHub URL, and that should be it. Any questions on this? Oh, it's always, all assignments will just make it due the following week, just like at midnight or something. That's fine. If you need an extension, just let me know. Hopefully you don't need one every single week, but I understand if things get busy. It's fine. Cool. Any last questions before we end? Yes.
Like Mondays midnight or Tuesdays?
Oh, Tuesdays midnight. Yeah, so the next class, yeah. So then this way you also have next lab period to also ask me questions if like you try it on your own, you get stuck, and you want to ask questions like in person. Yeah. Cool. And I will